You're listening to a podcast by the Center for Action and Contemplation. To learn more, visit cac.org.
This podcast explores the mystery of relatedness as an organizing principle of the universe and of our lives.
We are trying to catch a glimpse of connections beyond color, continent, country, or kinship through science, mysticism, spirituality, and the creative arts. I'm Donny Bryant.
I'm Barbara Holmes, and this is the Cosmic We. I'm going to take a moment to introduce our guest today, Belvie Rooks, and her partner, Baba Didan Gills. Let me tell you just a little bit about her life and her social activism. Belvie Rooks is co-founder of Growing a Global Heart with her late husband, Didan Gills. She's a writer, educator, producer, whose work weaves together the worlds of spirituality, feminism, ecology, and social justice. She served on several boards that reflect her commitment to justice seeking. She served as a core faculty member at Holy Names University Culture and Spirituality program. Belvie has published works that have appeared in many books and anthologies. And the most recent that we'll be talking about today is I Give You the Springtime of My Blushing Heart. Now, because their partnership continues and because their lives are intertwined, I want to just give you a brief bio of her late husband, Didan Gills. He is co-founder of Growing a Global Heart. He is writer, poet, producer, environmental activist. He pioneered the idea of green recovery, a concept that combines stewardship and restoration of blighted urban areas. Didan was a mentor for rising generations, a motivator for people struggling in those urban environments, including the homeless, the drug addicted, and the incarcerated. Is there anything else you want the audience to know, Belvie, about you and your beloved partner?
Well, thank you so much, Barbara. I have been looking forward to this because it's given me a chance to think deeply about my path and journey. And I realized that, meeting Dr. King, well, he actually was not Dr. King when I met him as a 15-year-old in 1958 in San Francisco. He was working on his doctorate. And I realized that there are just such important ways in which that was such a profound moment for me, which I didn't realize then. He came and the American Friends Service Committee had invited 400 young people from all over California. And there was this young minister that we had not heard of, and he spoke to our hearts. And I remember we stood and we held each other and we cried because he ended by saying that we were special, but not in an elitist way, but we were special because he felt he could trust us to keep the faith and to love a better world into existence. And I feel that so much of what I've done was seated in that moment and in that encounter.
Wow, what a wonderful blessing for your generation,
Yeah.
He's saying, I trust you to carry on. My. What was the context for the gathering?
The context for the gathering was the American Friends Service Committee, and I had done some work with them in the past, and the person responsible for the youth program had heard about this young minister, and the Montgomery boycott had occurred, but he was not a known person. In fact, when I checked in writing an essay that I was working on, there's nothing really recorded about his being there. at a C. Lamar. So the context for the gathering was the American Friends Service Committee, the Quaker Service Organization, had felt that it was really important for 400 randomly selected, I don't know, never knew how I got selected, to meet and hear this person, this young man. And one of the other historical footnotes was that I didn't know it at the time, but there was a young woman on the bus. We took a bus, and the bus stopped in Palo Alto, and this young woman got on with a huge guitar that was almost as big as she was. And she said her name was Joan, and we all were singing back in the back, and she said Baez, and I said, what kind of name is Baez? And so and it turns out her mother was the receptionist at the Quaker Center where we went. So Joan, and our joke got to be that the students in the South might be demonstrating not to sit in the back of the bus, but we felt all the cool kids were in the back of the bus. So Joan came to the back of the bus and sang, and we all sang together. So it was a big shock to us when she opened for Dr. King. It was the first, when she walked out first, and she sang Until the 12th of Never. And that was a historical moment because she and Dr. King connected in that moment, and he invited her to come to the South with him, and she did. And she explains in some of her writings that at one point, I think I was 16, I think she was 17 or 18, but she says at one point her job in the South was waking a very tired Dr. King and to make sure he got up and that they were out on the road. So there's that just historical footnote.
Amazing. There's such a connection here because I was a Joan Baez groupie. And so when my father and I went to the second march in Selma, who is there the night before this great march but Joan Baez and Bob Dylan?
Wow.
And the troopers had been called out. They hated us. They were glaring at us. But Joan and Bob sang, and we left that spot feeling everything was going to be okay.
Oh.
Great, great memories.
Such synchronicity, too.
Now, you and I have known each other. You and I have known each other for over 20 years. We met at a conference, and it was the occasion of the release of the first edition of Race in the Cosmos, an invitation to view the world differently. And it was during that session that you came into contact with your husband. Tell us the story of you and Didon meeting.
Actually, that's one of those magical. I think the ancestors and the angels often just guide us synchronistically, and so the synchronicity was, of course, Race in the Cosmos. You were. I was so excited to meet you, and you all, and it helped set up a radio program, and for you and Brian Swim, and then at the last minute, just you and Brian said, we think you should join us. And I said 3 people for our program is too many, and no, I'm not going to go. And there was something, and so I went out and lay in the sun, and at some point, there was no sun, and I looked up, and there's this looming Brian Swim, who is a mathematical cosmologist, said, we're not going, we insist that you come with us. And I ended up going, and I thought, well, okay, I'll just sit there and I'll not say anything. It was a Caroline Casey visionary activist show, and Brian said, Belvie's here. It's Belvie. Oh no, you have to join the show. And so I did reluctantly. Well, Didon had moved into the LA Eco Village and had, as he says, accidentally that night, the show aired in San Francisco at 2 p.m. and it aired in Los Angeles the following morning at 5 or so a.m. And he says he had accidentally left his radio on and I guess gotten up to go to the bathroom or something and came back and heard these voices and heard us talking about your book and Race in the Cosmos. And he had just moved into an intentional environmental community where he was one of the few, African Americans and was having a hard time struggling around race. And, these were committed people, but having challenging times. So the universe story, race in the cosmos, my work describing how I had gone to South Central to work with a group of young people around expanding their vision beyond the block, because I was really interested, because at that time, Los Angeles had the highest rate of gang violence in the country and probably the world. And I had been inspired by reading Brian Swimme and Thomas Berry's book, The Universe Story. And it had introduced me to this cosmic vision. And I felt that we could not condemn all these young men engaged in gang violence, which basically was a struggle over a block, when we had not had them understand that their place was so much larger than a block. So I developed a curriculum and went there, and I talked about it, and Didon got excited about it. He was excited about your work and started running around telling everybody about us and our work. And I think his friends were tired. They tell me they were so tired of him. You know, you have to read this, you have to read that. He was going and reading everything. And then one day his ex-wife came to him and said, some of those people that you're so excited about will be meeting at the Bioneers Conference in a few months. And he said, well, yeah, that's okay. I'm not going to go. She said, yes, you are, because I've already bought tickets and we're all going. And so that I always just say, Barbara, that you and Brian on this radio program, I met the person of my heartmate through that magic.
Yeah, magic of spirit. And you got married in Ghana in 2007. Tell us about that.
Well, Didon had, we were, needless to say, and, we had college kids married, and we just knew too many people. We had too many grandchildren. So we just decided to elope. And we thought, forget this. We're happy. People are happy. We're out of here, because and I had traveled extensively in Africa during the anti-apartheid era. I was an anti-apartheid activist. I'd met with the liberation movement leaders in Zambia and had, gone to UN conferences around apartheid in Tanzania. So I had traveled extensively in Africa. Didon had never been. And I felt like this was such an important time in our lives. We should just do something very special. And so I met an Akan spiritual teacher through Reverend Michael Beckwith's church I happened to go to. And Brother Ishmael Tete was there from Ghana. And I, sat in on some of his workshops, attended his sermons, and I went up and, told him how profoundly, grateful I was for his African spiritual, sharing in terms of, and I said, and I'm thinking about getting married, and I sure wish you were going to be here. And he said, well, if you come to Ghana, I'll perform the ceremony. And Didon and I decided that that's what we should do. I had traveled extensively in Africa, as I said, but I'd never been to Ghana. And, when we were in high school, Ghana was, being the first African nation to gain its independence from British colonial rule, was just like, we couldn't believe it. We said we were going to go. So we ended up going. Little did we know, that, Ghana had gained its independence in 1957, which meant that 2007, they were in a year-long celebration of their 50th anniversary. So we felt like everybody was celebrating our marriage. So the country was celebrating. And so we couldn't believe that we had just accidentally shown up at the 50th anniversary. So we felt that was just really, it was a wonderful time to be there. And we had decided actually also that we would visit Elmina Slave Dungeon after our wedding. So a few days after our wedding. And people had said, you're on your honeymoon and you're going to a slave dungeon. And we were explaining that we were really going to honor the fact that everybody who looked like us in this part of the world, quote unquote, new world, had an ancestor who had come through one of those more than 100 slave dungeons along the west coast of Africa. And that was why we went. And it was profoundly life-changing, both in terms of the heartbreak and ultimately in terms of the heart opening. Could I just read you a paragraph or so from my journal about?
Of course, yeah.
Belvie's journal at El Mino. As I stood looking out at the vast ocean beyond, I tried hard to imagine what reaching this spot, this door of no return, must have felt like for some long ago unremembered African ancestor as she stood trembling on the precipice of a terrifyingly unknown and uncertain future. One of the most horrifying bits of information shared was the fact that, at the height of the slave trade, there were so many dead and dying and sick people and dying bodies that were tossed into the sea at this very spot. The frenzied feeding opportunity resulted in the change of the shark migration pattern along this entire bit of coast. Tears flowed uncontrollably. I sobbed as I glanced at the ocean a few feet below. It was hard to process the fact that for over 300 years without interruption, millions of African men, women, and children had begun the long journey into slavery from this very spot. The names of the people passing through the door of no return have all been erased from our historical memory. The names of the mothers and the fathers and the children and the sisters and the brothers and the babies and the aunts and the potters and the weavers and the farmers and the priests and the healers, most of whom were women. The numerous slave dungeons, over 400 on the west coast of Africa, are living monuments and stark reminders of our inhumane history and what we have done to each other. For a couple of days afterwards, the tears flowed uncontrollably. Something broke, you know. I was filled with hatred, and I felt like I didn't want to see another white person anytime soon, and I forgot everything that I knew and everything that I practiced, and I just went home, went to bed, and I couldn't stop crying. And part of what I was crying about was just, I had gone back afterwards and sat in the women's dungeon because I had heard and actually traveled up the back stairs of the governor's mansion, where every so often he had all, and the back stairs led into the women's courtyard at the dungeon, you know, and he would have them, we were told that they would be brought out, and he would select a young woman to come up. And I just my heart broke, and I couldn't stop crying. And finally, Didan came to me and said, I know this is hard. It's been hard for me, but what is it that hurts so bad? And I told him that it was the erasure, that we knew the investors, we knew the name of the ships, we knew when it left, you know, America, when it stopped in Jamaica. We knew everything except the people, and that it was just the wound of erasure. And he said, as you will recall, his question was, what would healing look like?
Many of us feel increasing anger at injustice, violence, and indifference in our world today. Join us March 14th for What Do I Do With My Anger? An online gathering featuring Richard Rohr and Brian McLaren. Learn ways of transforming anger into loving action, inspired by Father Richard's new book, The Tears of Things. Register today at cac.org/anger. That's cac.org/ANGER.
Well, Belvie, I have to say that hearing the reading from your journal brought back imagery from a piece that was in the book, I Give You the Springtime of My Blushing Heart. And that piece was entitled Sacred Wound. And as you mentioned, the wound of erasure, It reminded me of that piece. Do you mind just reading a piece from that for us and for our audience?
The Sacred Wound. This was a piece that Didon wrote. He was a recovery counselor at the point at which I met him, which meant that there was something to recover from. And the sacred wound. The sacred wound is a wound so deep, so utterly piercing to the soul, that it opens up a pathway of compassion for all beings who suffer. One day I realized that this odd journey that I had been on had delivered me to a place of compassion that I could not explain. It seemed that when I would encounter someone suffering, I could feel it myself and had this compulsion to reach out to them and to touch them and to soothe them and to weep with them. Something welled up inside of me. It was as if we shared the beat of a common heart.
Remember Didon's question, what would healing look like? And basically, that's the question to our nation, to all people suffering trauma, suffering from just the malaise of society itself. What does healing look like for you now that Didon is in the realm of the ancestors? And what did you learn about grieving?
Oh, Barbara, I think this has been, and it's been 5.5 years. It's so hard to even imagine because he's so present. But I just had to disconnect from everything that we had known because there were too many triggers and so many triggers. And I basically fell apart. But now I realize I just surrendered to the love and the grief. And I went to Colorado and I just cried a lot. And my therapist, I had gotten wise enough to get a friend who was a therapist and I could deal with long distance. And she just kept reminding me as people were worrying, how important it was to get on with life. And that made me angry, actually. And she just said to me one day, Belvie, remember, the grief journey is different for everybody, and it takes as long as it takes. And I'm grateful that I had the privilege of allowing it to take as long as it took. And I could really try to remember the love that we shared, but more importantly, he said as he was leaving Zen Hospice, and he said, look, we have planted a lot of seeds, and those seeds will need nurturing now more than ever. Just know that I would be there. And in the midst of my despair, I said, for somebody who had gone through recovery, who had made amends, whose word was impeccable, I said, what if I believed he was really here? What if I believed him when he said, just know and trust that I will be there? And it was at that point that I went back to what we had been working on, which was springtime. I went back to being in touch with all of the young people. Part of our work and collaboration was intergenerational wisdom circles. And that's what he meant about the seeds that we planted.
One of the things that has helped me that I've learned from you is the role of ritual in healing. And I think it's in your book that you say that, well, while you were in Ghana and while you were considering what healing would look like, it was recommended that you do a ritual of cleansing in the waters so that you do not walk with sorrow.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that ritual.
Well, that was really very interesting because when Didon came to me with just so much love, and what would healing look like? And, when you're in the pain, it was just like, what, healing? I was annoyed, actually. Here I am crying. But his question and the love planted a seed so that the next morning I remembered what the elders had said. I had not remembered it. So his planting that seed. So the next morning I got out of bed because they had said, when you visit the slave dungeons, when you come back, try and find the nearest body of water, running water, and do a ritual and wash because you do not want to walk with all that sorrow. So I got out of bed and went down to the ocean, the Pacific, where a friend had gifted us for our honeymoon. And across the bay, I could see the slave dungeon. And the ritual, they said, had been to ritually wash my feet. And as I was ritually washing my feet, and Didon's question about what hurt so bad is that the people had been erased. As I was ritually washing my feet, I kept hearing in my mind, plant a tree, plant a tree, plant a tree. And then I realized that my friend Alice Walker had a poem called Torture, in which that's the refrain, plant a tree. But I thought it was a poem about sadness and heartbreak. When they torture your mother, plant a tree, is one of the lines. When they torture your father, plant a tree. When they torture your leaders and your brother, plant a tree. But it was in that moment of doing the ritual that I realized that I had been focusing on the death and the dying that preceded the plant a tree, but that the tree, that it was a poem of hope, because the very act of planting a tree meant a commitment to the future, because it took trees a long time to grow. But more importantly, the act of planting a tree on the day of our wedding in Accra, 400,000 Ghanaians in northern Ghana had been displaced by a flood. And that Bishop Tutu had pointed out that in Africa, catastrophic climate change looks like drought sometimes and looks like flooding the next. So I had just experienced, I thought it was Katrina when I looked at the newspaper the next morning after our wedding and saw all these Black people with things on their head and in the midst of this So in that moment, I didn't connect all those dots then, but in that moment, I realized that planting a tree in the context of catastrophic climate change and what was happening to the planet was a way of ritually, and planting them ceremonially and ritually, was a way of breathing new life into all of these forgotten spirits and souls.
That's the foundation of growing a global heart.
Yes. And I'm always still quite amazed in the context of doing the ritual that the vision appeared.
Oh, it always evokes something. Do you remember being at Haley Farm about 15 years ago?
I do.
And the women from New Mexico began a ritual counterclockwise dance.
Yes.
And I'm Gullah, so I knew enough to get off of the 30, the 12, the 15, and the 45. I grabbed my computer and I ran. You were sitting at the 45. At each of those key points, there was an eruption, spirit happening. Each of those 4 points, there was something that happened that I will never forget. I mean, I know it's not really shareable, but it was a ritual that unwound time.
Well, that your being and having a Gullah, background and ancestors that you honor and that you know, really has meant a lot, actually, in a lot of ways. And synchronistically, my Praise Song for the Widow by Paul Marshall is just an amazing and astonishing book that meant so much to me. And I have not read it for over 20 years, but I finally woke up and realized, wait a minute, as we're on Carriacou, and I'm thinking about you and thinking about the Gullah tradition in, that our part of the world and you, I realized how important it is for us to reconnect, particularly at this time, with those ancient wisdom traditions.
Yes. I have seen coming across my Facebook feed a lot of activity in California right now that you're involved in, saving the trees. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, because part of what happened was this tree metaphor and trees that breathe for the whole, we saw it in a very, I realized growing a global heart, we were thinking about it. You have to allow the time for visions to express themselves, right? So the trees were there, the tree metaphor and breathing for the whole. And Didan wrote several, poems about the trees. And I realized that now I'm back. I didn't think I was going to be here back in California, back on this coast. I had left because it was so triggering. And I come back at a time when I moved here in the 80s, and I came when Alice Walker won the Pulitzer, and we started a publishing company that she had been visioning and dreaming about, and decided she just won the Pulitzer. So if we were going to start it, we should do it now. And I left Mother Jones and came here in the early 80s. And when I arrived, there were people in the trees trying to protect the trees. Julia Butterfly Hill, who ended up actually writing a blurb for the book, had stayed in a tree for 2 years. And I could not believe that here I am back here 25 years later. And this is what I'm being presented with. And I felt the despair in the young people. And I felt like I needed to come out of and be more active and mainly support them in understanding what we learned, what we got right. And so I stepped in as a mentor, really, for a 13-year-old goddess daughter of mine, as she gets up and, has just taken this on. And I really realized that, my grandmother's, one of her favorite mantras was from the Book of Esther. And it basically, she would always remind me when I was kind of like wondering and trying to figure it out. She always reminded me, but for such a time as this, that you were born. And so coming back after 20 years, nearly 30 years, and having these young people deal with the same issue. And there's something, there's just something very frightening about a culture that does not honor and has gotten rid of the majority of trees that were 2,500 years old, many of them. And that there's a tree here in town that shows the size and the number of rings when Christ was born, when the Magna Carta was signed. So yes, I really, really have just had to step up and be present for the planet, for the future, and for these young people whose futures are just being, who are being devastated by the prospect of what they're experiencing. And we're experiencing fires in California, and my grandson has his apartment flooded in New York. But it takes me back to our wedding day in Africa, in Ghana, being confronted with catastrophic climate change. And here we are 30 years later, 400,000 people displaced, people being displaced right now in Germany. A friend of mine said his family is from the region where there's flooding and they can't find 1,300 people have been lost. So I just feel that, but for such a time as this, that we're here. And as I say, think about Didan when he said, he would be there. And I've been thinking about my grandmother, and I so respect the Gullah people because of the emphasis on elders and history. But I thought, my grandmother, what if she, not just but for such a time as this that I was born, but for such a time as this that we were born here together.
Yes. And I mean, we never realized this would happen, that we would age, but we are now. We thought we would be young forever, but we are now elders.
Right.
And so the thoughts that you're leaving with us are blessings upon another generation. We are not promised that the tasks will end. We are just told that for such a time as this, you were born to continue the struggle.
Yes.
This is probably a good time to maybe reconnect with one of the pieces that I think was in the book, Springtime. I actually listened to it as an audiobook. And what was amazing about it is that to hear you read it and also to hear Danny Glover read it gave so much more texture and context to the work. And there was a piece, as you alluded to earlier, to a cosmic connection, and you alluded to the influence of our ancestors. But there's a piece in there early in the book called The Big Picture. And I wanted to give you an opportunity to maybe even read a piece from that book, because that book really stood out to me. It gave a different perspective. It invited us to reimagine, if you will, what life looks like. It allowed us to reimagine what grief looks like. And it puts us dead in the center and diametrically opposes various aspects of life. And I just wanted to see if you could read a little bit about that piece for us and invite us to be able to experience that for this moment.
This was a piece that really, I ended up doing a lot of editing of Didon's, and he only had a couple of things published while he was alive. And but this one he really sat with, and I saw it in various incarnations. I so love this piece. And it's called I Am. I am old and wise as the night. I am as beautiful as a bird in flight. I am the moon and the sea. I am the robin and the bee. I am the soil and I am the tree. I'm the lion and the gazelle. I am heaven and I am hell. I am the ring and I am the bell. I am the joy and I am the tear. I am the brave and I am the fear. I am the blistering desert. I'm the freezing snow. I'm the cringing coward and the gentle hero. I'm the aged and I am the young. I am the weak and I am the strong. I am the smile and I am the frown. I am the pauper and I am the crown. I am the wrong and I am the right. I am the day and I am the night. I am now and I am never. I am yesterday and I am forever. I am the bitter and I am the sweet. I live on the hill and I live on the street. I am the top and I am the bottom. I am Martin, Hitler, Gandhi, and Sodom. I am red, black, yellow, brown, and white. I love, hate, laugh, cry, and fight. All the universe is reflected in me. I am all that ever was and ever will be. When I lose, it's the lesson that I win. Judging others is my sin.
Wow.
And
thank you.
And thank you for asking, because this is special in another kind of way, because he kept not letting it go. And finally he brought it to me and, he asked me to read it. And I said to him, well, what you're saying is that you are all the universe and it's reflected in you. And you haven't really explicitly said that. And so I feel, so I contributed all the universe is reflected in me based on that conversation.
Wow. Very profound.
You're very profound. I just want to say thank you because, and I know this may be a little out of order, but I wanted to give my response and my it got pretty emotional as you were talking about grief in your process of healing. And I recently experienced a loss within the last year, experienced a divorce. And there is a grieving period. You know, it's
Yes.
like the loss of someone you love, or loss of a family, loss of something that's familiar. But your work and your insights and your journey, even your wisdom, has been very well received, at least on this side here. And I say thank you to that. In the Marvel Comics world, there's a Marvel series entitled WandaVision. Vision is a Marvel character who is actually not human, but but in season, and I hope this is not just a spoiler alert, but in season 1, I believe episode 8, there's a moment in episode 8 where Vision is sitting down with his soon-to-be wife Wanda, and she was grieving over the loss of her brother. And Vision was having a hard time processing, the pain. And he says something that is so profound. And he says, I really don't know grief because I've never had anyone to love. I've never loved anyone. And he said, what is grief except love, or love that perseveres? And I just thought that was so profound.
Oh, I'm sitting here just kind of very moved. Thank you for that.
That's the story of you indeed, Don. A love that perseveres. Thank you, Belvie. I love you. I love your work. Thank you for blessing us with your presence today.
And thank you both. Blessings and much gratitude.
Do you feel called to walk a more contemplative path? The Center for Action and Contemplation is an educational nonprofit supporting the journey of inner transformation. Our programs and resources will help grow your consciousness, deepen your prayer practice, and strengthen your compassionate engagement with the world. Learn more about our resources, such as publications, podcasts, email series, and events at www.cac.org.